And what they called those people who could prove that they were saved and therefore could become church members were the elect. Right? The elect. Get it? You know, Calvin said that people were predestined or elected to be slaves. So they were the elect. Now, if there is this comprehensive vision about what this colony, Massachusetts Bay, is about, and what, you know, the government should do, you know, how the government should act, and what people should do, what happens if people disagree with the vision? Well, we talked about famous dissenters from Massachusetts Bay, and in doing so, we said that Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were famous dissenters, people who challenged the city on the hill, the vision of a city on the hill in Massachusetts Bay. What was Williams' big challenge? What did Williams attack that gets him kicked out of Massachusetts Bay? Does anybody remember? Go ahead, Anna. Oh, one thing is he believed that they didn't legitimately purchase the land from the Native Americans. Go, Lucy. Yes. The big thing was this whole notion of using the civil government to enforce religious laws, which really would undermine kind of, you know, really the whole spirit of the colony. And so he is kicked out of Massachusetts Bay. And Elaine, when he is kicked out of Massachusetts Bay, what does he then become famous for doing? Yes, establishing another settlement south of Massachusetts province, which eventually becomes a colony into itself, Rhode Island. And we talked extensively about the nature of Rhode Island, how other dissenters and malcontents with Massachusetts Bay settled around Williams, and eventually, you know, a colony, 1644, was established. And one of them was Anne Hutchinson. What did she say that was so problematic? Go ahead, Nina.
She said that, like, God had spoken to her himself and, like, told her that what they're doing isn't how it is.
Oh, yes. I mean, she did claim that God had spoken to her in an immediate voice, and that got her thrown out. But what Anne Hutchinson really says that troubles people is it doesn't matter what you do. Remember, that's where you get into this whole discussion, does it matter what you do? And she said, no, it doesn't matter what you do. And she argued that the ministers in Massachusetts Bay were preaching a covenant of works, that it did matter what you did. And she said, well, it doesn't matter what you did. And her notions were called antinomianism. And they were considered dangerous, subversive to Massachusetts Bay, and that gets her kicked out. If I were looking in my book in that chapter at something, I would also look at something called King Philip's War. That may be something that we did not talk about in class that you might see on the test. And just for one tip, that has to do with the relationship between the colonists in Massachusetts and the Native Americans. King Philip's War. Also in that chapter 3 in your textbook, there is a discussion of the middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania. And, you know, we talked about the settlement of the middle colonies. We talked about New York first and then later Pennsylvania. And, you know, we said that New York was granted, you know, the land that would become New York was granted by Charles II to his brother, the Duke of York, James. We said what was interesting about that grant of land was that it was previously claimed and settled, although fledglingly, by the Dutch. And that when Charles granted the land to James, James had to take the land from the Dutch, which he did easily. The Dutch were really not in a position to resist James, because they had such a tenuous grip on the colony. It was poorly managed. The people really didn't like the way the Dutch West India Company controlled things. It was autocratic. And so when they were asked to fight to resist the British, they just didn't. And so James II takes over the New Netherlands and renames it New York. And we talked about New York. Now, one of the things that is mentioned in your textbook is sort of the nature of the society and the economy there. And there were large estates in New York along the Hudson River. But remember, James recognizes all the proprietary claims that people have there. And, you know, but we said the most distinctive feature about New York was its diversity. The diversity of people, particularly in New Amsterdam, which later becomes New York City. Now, we also talked about the establishment of Pennsylvania. And obviously Pennsylvania was established by William Penn, and William Penn was a Quaker. I think you probably should know that the Quakers believed that there was an inner light in all men. I think that you should probably know that belief generated a lot of other beliefs. A failure to recognize deference, pacifism, other things that were connected to Quakerism. I think you should probably know that Quakers were considered to be dangerous radicals. I think you probably should know that despite the fact that Quakers were persecuted, when Penn established Pennsylvania, he offered all of the people that went there kind of total religious freedom. Remember, Penn called Pennsylvania a holy experiment. And just like Massachusetts Bay was an attempt to really show the world what a Puritan society would look like, Pennsylvania was an attempt to show the world kind of what a Quaker society would look like. And you see that initially in the settlement of Pennsylvania. I mean, the big thing about Pennsylvania and New York is the diversity of people that go there. And certainly in Pennsylvania, the large number of Germans that go to Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Dutch, as they're called. And the Scotch-Irish and other ethnicities, the Swedes in the southern colonies in Pennsylvania, which become Delaware, are sort of important. Now, with sort of Pennsylvania and Delaware, New Jersey, New York, New England established, some questions about those. We hit some, there's only 50 questions on the test, we can't ask about everything. These are established. We kind of then went to, talking about some characteristics, some regional characteristics. And we talked a lot about the South, right? And we talked about the Chesapeake region. And when we did talk about the South, we talked about what defined the Chesapeake region was tobacco and a plantation-type society. And we said that people went there, despite the fact that it was horribly unhealthy and a terrible place to be because they thought they could make money growing tobacco. But in order to make money growing tobacco, you needed land and you needed labor. Land at least at first was easy enough to get. Labor was more difficult. So we talked about the nature of plantation labor in the Chesapeake region at length. And what we said was this. At first, most of the planters in the Chesapeake region used white indentured servants as the major type of labor on their plantations. By about 1700, there was a transformation to African slavery. And we talked about that at length. Oh, what was the headright system? Does anybody recall what was the headright system? Hey, go ahead, Josh. So in Maryland and Virginia, if you brought over an indentured servant, you had the opportunity to buy 50 acres of land, correct? That was the headright system. Hey, when we talk about an indentured servant, what ultimately, Boland, did they do? In return for payment, or in return for passage over to America, in return for providing for their needs, and some maybe potential land and other things afterwards, what did they give up? What did the indentured servant give up potentially for passage, upkeep, and potentially land? What did they sacrifice? Their freedom, right? They basically sold themselves into slavery for a period of time. They sold their labor into slavery for a period of time, and they would work. The term indenture was the agreement between the person that brought the worker over and the worker. Right? So an indentured servant was someone who had signed or agreed to such a labor arrangement. 3/4 of all the people who came to Maryland and Virginia in the 17th century were, in fact, indentured servants. 3/4 of them. The majority of people that labored on these plantations were indentured servants. Eventually, that wasn't the case, and we gave a number of reasons why. And one of the things that we mentioned as a reason why was something called Bacon's Rebellion. What do you recall, if anything, of Bacon's Rebellion? We must go quickly now. Go ahead, yes, Brian.
It was an indentured servant that wasn't given the land that they